If you accept the premise that our political, economic, and security ties with Europe are the strongest we have globally, well, then it follows that what happens on the European continent has ramifications for our own security.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GNSI's video series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by retired Ambassador P. Michael McKinley. He served over 37 years in diplomatic service. During that time, he was a four-time ambassador, leading some of the U.S.'s largest embassies in the world, including in Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Brazil. Today, he is a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. Today in our discussion, we'll discuss the recent BRICS Summit in Russia, as well as the role that organization will play in the future. The BRICS nations currently comprise over 45% of the world's population, as well as 27% of the world's GDP. Well, welcome, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very happy to be with you.
So we want to start the conversation today with the BRICS nations. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then the additional countries that recently joined. Could you kind of give us a breakdown of where the BRICS has come from and how we got into the recent BRICS Summit in Russia?
Absolutely, because the BRICS Summit, which took place in the last week of October, was something of a breakthrough for this organization, which had its first meeting only in 2009, 2010. And at the time was composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, South Africa being added in 2010. And the concept of pulling together this organization was 2006. So it took some time for the political commitments to be made by the member states, but it was made. I think as people who know BRICS, the acronym came about because of a banker who in 2001, and I'm not sure whether it was JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley, you're going to have to forgive me, a guy named Jim O'Neill came up with a shorthand to describe the importance of what seemed to be emerging markets on the world stage. And it was easy to make that case because the Chinese economy was booming and shifting. Russia's was coming out of a deep recession in the late 1990s. Brazil was beginning to ride the commodity boom. And India was undergoing a series of governments which brought about important reforms in how the national economy was managed. But certainly across the 2010s, there was the question mark of what was the organization for? What did it actually accomplish? And many, particularly observers in the West, viewed it as nothing more than a platform for speaking with each other, but a group of nations which found it difficult to develop commonalities. One of the observations that's thrown out is that the composition, certainly by the 2010s, was 3 democracies and 2 countries that were not so democratic, in the case of China and Russia. And so finding common ground on policies and moving forward seemed to be a bit of a struggle. But across the 2010s, a clear sense of purpose emerged. And it was premised on the idea that the United States, other Western nations, and the post-1945 Bretton Woods organization of the world, IMF, the World Bank, the UN system, were dominated by Western nations who imposed their worldview, their requirements, had a certain view of the global economy. And it was time to present an alternative view, especially given the growing economic power of countries in what has often been called the global South as a catch-all, but includes most emerging markets outside of Western Europe, Northeast Asia, and North America. And as they defined this agenda, which was focused on a multipolar world as opposed to unipolar, multipolarity, focused on revising the exclusivity of World Bank, IMF, UN Security Council, and taking a look at how perhaps the global economy could be organized differently. Early on, the proposals to not quite de-dollarize international trade, but certainly promote the importance of other currencies as alternatives for global commerce. They began to flesh out what at the beginning in the first few years seemed to be very thin substance. And so you see the creation of a development bank in which billions of dollars were provided by the member states, the 5 states. And to date, I think something like $32 billion have been distributed worldwide for 90 plus projects. And there was an attempt also to build out a relationship with other countries in the global south. A couple of years ago, but actually predating the past couple of years, China had been driving to broaden the grouping. India and Brazil in particular were opposed to expanding the BRICS beyond the 5, fearing a dilution. And also, as we drew to the end of the 2010s and the beginning of this decade, fearing an organization which they have been at pains to say is not anti-West, was drifting in a direction where there would be a clear alignment and an alignment with political powers globally who were antagonistic to the West. But nonetheless, in 2023, India agreed to expansion. Brazil followed suit. And that's what made 2024 and the summit in Kazan, Russia, so different from previous summits, because for the first time in the 15 years of the existence of the BRICS as a formal grouping of nations, we had the addition of 4 additional countries, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, and I'm going to miss out on the other one because Iran. I'm blanking out Iran deliberately.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's probably good.
I'm joking. I forgot. But I was focused on Argentina, which of course backed out from accepting to become a member of the BRICS. But the meeting in Kazan was significant for another reason. It was being hosted in Russia almost 3 years after the invasion of Ukraine, almost 3 years after extraordinarily significant sanctions had been placed on Russia. And for Russia, it became a showcase of its success in not being isolated on the global stage. 36 heads of state from around the world turned up for the conference. And the UN Secretary General Guterres, and he was criticized by by a number of nations, chose to go to Russia and attend the conference, even though he made the required points on the war in Ukraine. And so, in many ways, it was a successful coming out party for President Putin.
So with the summit in Kazan, with Erdogan and some other key leaders at the summit, what's that really showing the West and the United States about the BRICS? Is this making it more important of an organization?
Not necessarily, because what I think we're seeing, and numerous observers have commented on this, globally, it's the emergence of middle powers. The Economist calls them the transactional 25. You have the term global South. And you certainly see a changing dynamic both in the global economy with a different emergence of regional powers. And you see it in terms of how they're looking and hedging their bets on the big political questions of the day. And so BRICS is a manifestation of that and the interest of other countries in either joining or at least being part of the gatherings when they take place. And I think that explains a lot why 36 heads of state were there. But among them were allies of the United States, countries that are dependent on Western markets for their prosperity. And so the subtext is really that most of these countries are not looking to take sides. And this is a theme and an issue which I think has emerged since before the pandemic, but has become much more pronounced in the last 3 to 4 years. And it's governments who believe they can keep channels of communication open with Russia, with China, with the United States, with different regional groupings, as they pursue, first and foremost, their national interests and avoid being pushed into alignment, into an us or them equation, which has them pitting themselves either against China or against the United States when their interests lie in having good relations, in their view, with both countries.
So is there any parallel with the non-aligned group during the Cold War, where we're really not trying to pick sides or hedging their bets?
I don't think so, in the sense that we're in a very different world now. Non-aligned included just about every country which was not considered a developed country, as the terminology in play in those days stated. What we're seeing now is a much more concerted effort, a strategic one, by key countries that are playing an important role, whether it's in regional Southeast Asian economies. The Gulf economies are becoming major investors around the world and certainly key to prosperity and a bridge between the Middle East and South Asia. We're seeing Indo-Pacific build up as an alternative, interesting area, both in political, security, and economic terms. We're seeing efforts by Latin America to take advantage of a moment in which there's renewed demand for commodities, whether it's foodstuffs, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's energy supplies. We're seeing the digital transformation of global economy and different countries reacting to it in ways which sometimes benefit them, whether it's developing their own capabilities, as we're seeing in places like Brazil, India, Colombia, or attracting investment, as we're seeing with the multiplication of semiconductor investments, data centers being built everywhere. And so it's a very dynamic moment in which these countries are very clearly looking to engage in what's a transformational event, whether it's economic, whether it's political alignments, whether it's on climate change, and sort of attending BRICS or being part of another club is part of that, but it's not meant to be an exclusive decision, which ends up pitting them against other groupings around the world.
Right. Yeah. Because even the summit's own text said that its focus was, quote, promoting the entire range of partnership and cooperation within the framework of the association's 3 key tracks: politics and security, the economy and finance, and then cultural and humanitarian ties, end quote.
And actually, if you take a look at what BRICS actually achieves, I mentioned the NDB, the Development Bank, and that's not insignificant as a lender for certain projects around the world, but it hardly begins to rival the capabilities of the World Bank institutions, for example. And you look at the actual specifics of results. Well, there's not much in terms of political and security cooperation. On the cultural and exchanges, on humanitarian issues, it's there's certainly efforts, but it's not going to be world shaking in terms of its impact. And you see a lot of emphasis on issues like trade, approaches to trade. They talk about currencies. They talk about cooperation on education. They talk about cooperation on health, response to pandemics, and so on. Not very different from a lot of the other big transnational fora we see throughout any given year in terms of focus. So I think trying to look at this in terms of substance of summit declarations, that's not the message coming out of the BRICS. The other aspect is the BRICS, they don't have a secretariat. It's not as though this is fleshed out in a manner which allows for systematic building out of the stated objectives of closer cooperation. The top lines, and I'll come back to that, are essentially offering a platform in which the so-called non-Western world can challenge what they see as the hegemony of Western states, especially Europe, the United States, Japan, and South Korea, over international institutions, international norms, and whom they see as pushing their view of political developments or responses that are required to crises, and trying to set up an alternative platform to say, we're not looking for alignment, we're looking to respond to global concerns from our perspective, and to also create a basis for the non-aligned countries, for the emerging economic and political powers of the globe to have a greater seat at the table, whether it's at the IMF and the World Bank, whether it's in the UN Security Council, whether it's in response to international crises as they take place. That's, if you will, if you want to put a political chapeau on it, that's the chapeau. But the challenge is these countries are very different. And so Brazil and India, you'll notice that the summit declaration, notwithstanding the efforts of Russia, had nothing on Ukraine or support for Russia's position on Ukraine, despite what was reported as a significant push by President Putin to get that support. And you had President Modi, Xi Jinping, you had Lula, all specifically saying they favored a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. They called on parties not to add additional fire to the conflict. Not quite the message Putin would have wanted coming out of that 3-day meeting. And so we really need to remember when we're looking at BRICS, this is not a coalition. It's a grouping of nations with some overlapping interests. The primary concern, developing more of a voice at the table on international issues and international institutions, and pursuing their own national interests. And amongst them, just think about the tensions that exist, whether they are between India and China on border issues, although there was an agreement reached on renewing patrolling on the disputed India-China border areas. Think about Iran's conflicts and tensions with Gulf states. We now have the UAE as a member of the BRICS. If we take a look at the tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia over Nile River concerns, go down the list. This is not an obvious grouping moving towards a consolidation of an alliance. That's not what we're up against. Where we need to have greater respect for this is that it's a platform and a meeting space where world leaders with some intersecting concerns have the opportunity to get together and project an image, or not an image, messages that put, if we can use the term, the West on notice, that there are concerns they have that need to be taken into account. And I think as you see policies moving forward, certainly under the Biden administration, but amongst Europeans as well, in the summits of the European Union, NATO summits, and G7 summits, there has been an accelerated effort to invite key actors, leaders from other countries, broaden the scope of discussion. And the hope is that the G20 actually emerges and consolidates as the key fora for these emerging countries to interact with the United States, with Western Europe, with Japan, and South Korea, and develop sort of common approaches and policies to the challenges of the world today.
So how did Argentina go about looking to join the BRICS and then actually withdrawing their
there's
attendance?
A political component and overlay in which there's no question that since Ukraine, and with the growing tensions between the United States and China on a host of issues, that there has been an effort by Russia and China to perhaps to direct the BRICS in more of an anti-Western way. In other words, present BRICS as an alternative grouping, which is also a challenge to the West. And other member states, that's not where they want to go. They really do not want to be presented as anti-West. They don't want BRICS presented as anti-West. That said, with Russia and China, first, the meeting hosted in Russia, despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the numerous sanctions in place on Russia, and China's growing strategic ties with Russia, with the axis we've all noted of North Korea, Iran, and China and Russia, whether it's of convenience because of the moment or something that's going to develop as more of a challenge in the coming years, certain countries are going to have reservations about what this means. And Argentina said yes under one government, which was left of center, and with their new president decided not ready to be part of what looks like an anti-Western coalition in the making. I repeat, India and Brazil were the two key other big economies in the BRICS, are not interested in seeing this move in the direction of an antagonistic relationship with the West.
With that in mind, how does the BRICS nation and the number of other war leaders that showed up to this summit, how does that signal to the West in its sanction regime against Russia and its sanction regime against Iran?
Sanctions regime, sanctions against China, sanctions against Ethiopia, go down the list. There is certainly a view among, and you'd have this debate if it was being discussed in the G20, whether a Western sanctions approach to resolving questions, differences, trade disputes is the right approach to the modern world where, frankly, there's a number of different emerging powers, different centers of power, and different ways of looking at things. So when you take a look at Russia, China, Iran on sanctions, well, you have to add several other countries who also have concerns about what they see as an imposition by the West of sanctions in pursuit of their own political interests, but not necessarily policy that they're supportive of. And again, we don't need to see this in China or Russia terms. Most countries around the world really do want to be non-aligned. And most countries in the world are not keen on extraterritorial sanctions regimes. And so this debate, which I think is ongoing, we're having the debate about the effectiveness of sanctions here in the United States as we look out to the world and the different conflicts we're trying to address. Europeans, too. It's not that sanctions are going to be abandoned, but there certainly seems to be a vigorous discussion developing over how best to apply them and to make them effective when we're trying to pursue certain objectives.
Right.
And
I was going to say, because it's hard to get everybody on board. Sanctions don't really work very well.
And if we take a look at the sanctions on Russia, which are the most comprehensive ever instituted against a developed economy, a major country, fact of the matter is much of the rest of the world, not most of the world's countries, continue to have normal trading relations with Russia, notwithstanding the sanctions, including many of our best friends.
Yeah. So with the sanctions regimes and these other things that BRICS are able to challenge the Western world leadership on, what role does China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, play within the BRICS? Is this another venue for them to expand?
I think China has a multi-layered approach to deepening its engagement with the world. First and foremost, the trading ties that China has developed. I think the figure is 120 plus countries around the world. Their largest trading partner is China. If you take a look at Southeast Asia and the growth of trade since 2018 to 2023 amongst countries, the ASEAN alliance countries, for example, trade has increased by almost 50%. So trade is very much the calling card, I think, of China in most of the world. And even with the United States, we still have a several $100 billion trading relationship, even though it's beginning to decline as a percentage of our total trading ties with the world. But China has also developed a approach to economic development and tried to build up regional cooperation and uses mechanisms like the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013, Shanghai Cooperation Council organization, which I think came about in 2017, 2018 later. But these are mechanisms in which they're trying to deepen strategic ties with countries. And I think the shorthand on Belt and Road is any number of countries are now realizing that it comes with a price tag. And whether it's sovereign debt, whether it's dependency, and there's less interest. You hear less about the Belt and Road Initiative these days. And there's a reason. Countries have seen through and decided, do we need this? We need the commercial ties with China, but it doesn't need to be accompanied by other relations. So you have this paradox of a fair number of countries and still new countries joining Belt and Road Initiative, but you're seeing less of an emphasis on the projects, on the dynamics of lending. Sovereign lending, for example, in Latin America by China since 2015 has all but disappeared because the governments recognized it was debt entrapment and stopped doing it. We have the famous examples of Sri Lanka in South Asia, of Zambia in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ecuador in South America, and countries learned from this and are certainly taking a different approach to it. So is China, by the way. So the commercial and investment relationships are becoming more sophisticated, and you're seeing Chinese investment in everything from telecoms to infrastructure in countries on a commercial basis. And that's certainly something that may change the dynamic of China's ties with some of these countries in the future.
And is China able to use the BRICS though as a way?
I don't really see. I don't really see the intersection. It's other than China is obviously the most important economic and political actor in BRICS, and can certainly speak about what it wants to speak about, but it's not using BRICS to push its agenda explicitly on these other bilateral initiatives it has going, or multilateral initiatives it has going, which are fairly significant. So I repeat, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Belt and Road Initiative, the efforts to make the renminbi, yuan, international currency for trade, pushing for alternative financing mechanisms through development banks. All of these are part and parcel of China's projection internationally, but it doesn't depend on the BRICS.
So for the BRICS summit, going back to the summit in Kazan, what was the absence of the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva? Is that any
I don't think there was any significance in that. He addressed the conference by video conference, and certainly, Brazil has been a significant player in terms of projection of the BRICS. But Brazil's a significant player on any number of fronts as well. So Brazil's going to be the host of COP29 and is a leader internationally on climate change and sustainable environmental policy. We have the G20 meeting coming up in Rio de Janeiro, which is without question in the interest of Brazil to be reaching out to not just the presence of China or global South countries, but the United States, Western European governments, and so on. Brazil has a very sophisticated, developed approach to trying to sustain ties around the world.
And what's Brazil's take? Is it using BRICS as one of those ways to connect ties?
Yes, absolutely. So, when you take a look at Brazil as an international actor, it's one of the leading countries on multilateralism. And so certainly very present in many organizations around the world.
And going back to the summit one more time, like you noted.
But let me come back to that point about what are, how do countries look at BRICS if they're not Russia or China? They're looking at it, I repeat, in terms of non-alignment.
When you say non-alignment,
non-alignment means not taking sides on alliances or groupings around the world that are seen to be in conflict with each other. So whether it's Russia and China at this time having a more common position on issues like Ukraine or sanctions or trade, or the United States and its NATO allies or its East Asian allies and having certain positions. These countries don't want to be forced into a position, whether it's on Ukraine, whether it's on Israel and Gaza, whether it's on the Strait of Taiwan. They're going to make their own decisions on the basis of their own national interests. And for most of these countries, their own national interests requires sustaining relationships both with the United States and with China in different ways. So this isn't multi-alignment in which there's phrases, multi-alignment, non-alignment. It really is a decision to forge a semi-independent course. So in the context of India, which I think has articulated a very significant doctrine on strategic autonomy, it involves continuing to build relationships across the board. And some of those will include strategic imperatives, which align more closely with the United States or Western countries or Indo-Pacific strategy, and others will require a different approach. They're among the biggest buyers of Russian oil.
Right. Yeah, well, and speaking of buyers of Russian oil, and we talked about the sanctions earlier, like you mentioned, the results of the summit, there was nothing about the war in Ukraine definitively. So for the Russians, was the summit a success just politically, or is there any implications for the war itself?
I don't believe there's any implications for Ukraine from the summit, other than the emphasis on a negotiated solution and the quiet refusal, if I can say it that way, of numerous countries not to be forced into taking a position supportive of Russia was very evident. No one's condoning internationally a sovereign state invading another sovereign state to attempt to either eradicate it from existence or seize significant portions of its national territory. Now, I think those of us who back Ukraine and believe it's the existential struggle of our time, I do think it's important that there be stronger international support for Ukraine, especially as we enter this moment in which, the military challenges are becoming more significant again for Ukraine, in which financial support from both Europe and the United States perhaps may not be on the same scale in the coming year, but the principles of sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity affect every single country in the world. And Ukraine is the case in point, which requires, I think, the international community to continue to provide the strongest support for Ukraine as it seeks a just settlement.
What would you recommend moving forward in dealing with Ukraine from even the U.S. or the Western perspective?
I am subjective on this, so I'm not going to give you a measured view. I do think it's the existential struggle for our times. Most important relationship the United States has in the world is still with Western Europe, in political terms, in security terms and cooperation, in economic terms. And I'm fully mindful that Mexico is now our largest trading partner, that USMCA is an absolutely gigantic trading bloc on the global stage. But when you take the three strands I've mentioned in terms of political, security, and economic cooperation, Europe remains our most significant alliance. And so as we look at what's happening in Ukraine, you have the principle of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, which we all want to see respected in every part of the globe, but is being challenged with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But we also have the broader question of whether failure in Ukraine, what the ramifications would be for European and therefore American security. If you accept the premise that our political, economic, and security ties with Europe are the strongest we have globally, well, then it follows that what happens on the European continent has ramifications for our own security. Not suggesting the pivot to Asia is not justified. What I am suggesting is that we can't take our eyes off of what's happening on Ukraine. And so in an ideal situation, you would continue to see sustained security and economic support for Ukraine from both European allies and the United States. And I mentioned security and economic support because keeping a government running, bureaucracies, agencies, services, the Europeans have provided over $100 billion. We've provided over $100 billion, mostly in security support. The assistance needs to be sustained to keep. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting. Ukrainians are dealing with the consequences of the war. It seems to me that continued strong support, financial, political, for Ukraine as it continues to fight with Russia is absolutely critical. On the way forward, everyone notes the importance of a negotiated settlement. And what we are beginning to see now, not just because of elections in the United States and the coming change of government, is a greater emphasis on looking for the avenues for negotiated settlement. But if you'll forgive me, I'm not going to speculate on what a settlement might look like or what negotiations might look like. We need to agree on the principle that Ukraine's survival as a nation is first and foremost the critical objective.
To wrap up, should we see the BRICS as a challenge to the West?
Not necessarily. Still, a grouping of nations that includes Baker's dozen of countries that are very different in terms of their political systems, in terms of their economic priorities, the regions they come from. And as we've seen with this latest gathering in Kazan, which was the most ambitious yet, with the summit declaration, there is very little in terms of substantive results from 3 days of conversation. We should really be viewing BRICS on two levels. First, as a fora where countries that don't see themselves necessarily as aligned with either the West or China see an alternative grouping which gives them projection to discuss issues of mutual concern. And as I've mentioned before, those are the top lines of exclusion as they see it from whether it's the UN Security Council, whether it's in the multilateral system represented by the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions, whether it's security arrangements in different parts of the world. And it gives them the ability to at least project a vision in which they're pushing for a more equitable multipolarity or as they see it. But in terms of a challenge to the West, so many of the countries have their own views of what their national interests are. And it's very difficult to see as a moment in which countries like Brazil, India, the Emirates are going to align with Russia and China in an anti-Western organization. It's simply not on the cards at this moment. Even countries which are facing challenges and difficulties and may see an advantage in joining closer to Russia and China, like Ethiopia. Ethiopia maintains very strong ties with Western nations and certainly sees itself in the context of working across regions and not being held hostage, so to speak, to one grouping in particular. So as we look at other countries that are spoken about, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Thailand, whether it's Argentina in the future, it really should be looked at as a grouping of nations raising concerns, discussing them, but not necessarily projecting in a way that's hostile to the West. The message for the West, I think, is how does it use organizations like the G20 or reform of international institutions, expansion of the Security Council to address what are fundamental changes that we've seen over the last 10 years, developing really since the early 2000s in terms of a world that really is multipolar. If you don't want to say it's multipolar in security terms, it is when we talk about economies, and it is when we're talking about reactions to transnational challenges like climate change or pandemics. And it certainly is in the context of a world where the United States and China are the preeminent actors, but other parts of the world are still trying to find their own way forward.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
And thank you so much for the opportunity.
And that wraps up another episode of GNSI's video series. Today, we were joined by retired Ambassador P. Michael McKinley as we explored the rise of the BRICS nations and their potential challenge to the West. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute. And we thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you join us for our next video series episode.